news. Cybercriminals attacking great organizations, wreaking havoc on the trust of their brand.
We socialize cybersecurity for you to raise awareness.
Interviewing leaders who built and protect great brands.
We help talented people enter into this incredible field, and we share our research of blockbuster true cybercrime stories.
This is Cybercrime Junkies. And now the show. Well, good morning and welcome everybody to Cybercrime Junkies. I'm the creator and host, David Morrow, and with me today in the studio is Dawn Kristy. Welcome, Dawn.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, no, this is good. We're excited about speaking with you. We apologize that Mark couldn't be with us, but he will join us on the follow-up as well. And I'm sure he'll chime in when we edit this later. So he always does.
Okay.
We've got so Dawn, for the listeners and the viewers, Dawn is branded as the Cyber Dawn. She is she's been featured in cybersecurity news, Power Women Special Edition. She's an award-winning author of 33 Ways Not to Screw Up Cybersecurity. She's got over 20 years in complex claims experience. And we're going to get into some of that. We're going to talk about recent changes in cybersecurity insurance. What is cybersecurity insurance? What does it cover? What does it not cover? The unprecedented risk that's happening today, unlike a year ago or even 2 years ago. And then if there's time at the end, I always like to talk about things like cybercrime, TikTok banning, the U.S. strategy for cybersecurity, and more. But we can get to that if we get to that. So Dawn, walk us through real briefly your history. You've got a very storied history in cyber risk, claims, risk management, things like that. Can you walk the listeners through that?
Sure. I will keep it brief. And basically, my background has been emerging risk. So started out with environmental, moved to products, and all sorts of product recalls in my career. And then cyber. The first breach I ever heard about was in 2007, the TJ Maxx breach. I was like, wow,
Absolutely.
This is amazing stuff, yep. Right? So
yep.
That was the first light bulb moment. And then in 2012, I joined Aon and worked on complex claims there, a lot of professional liability, but also became the cyber subject matter expert. And I was hooked. I mean, what I loved about it was the fact that it's, if you're a wordings geek, like when I worked in environmental, I really learned how to analyze policies, and I've done that throughout my career. Not many people want to read insurance policies, right?
No, but I'll tell you, there's music in those pages in a sense, because each word has been litigated like 500 times. Like these are terms of art. Yeah. And I try to explain that to people that don't come from law or don't come from regulatory or insurance, industries, and they just don't get it. They're like, it's just a fine print. It's that. I'm like, no, if it says may, the sky's the limit, man. If it says shall, you're screwed. Like like there is little things like that, and terms of art that what we would normally think would mean something doesn't necessarily mean what we think it is.
Sure. And if you're pulled into that interpretation world, which I was back in my career, I never lost that love of looking at the policy language. I'm a wordsmith anyway, and then within insurance, it's a whole nother level. So environmental was litigated, challenged, impacted Lloyd's, all of that. And then now with this other bookend in my career, it's looking at these wordings that are not standard. So every policy is unique. It can be tailor-made, and the insureds often want it tailor-made. What can they put in? What can't they put in? So I basically, especially when I was with the large broker, got into what I really love to do, which is writing and teaching. I mean, I really kind of spread the gospel, so to speak, motivate people, because we are individual users within an entity. And now with the work from home, we're individual users working, but we're at home, and we still have devices that we're possibly sharing and all of that. So it's really kind of a new era that we're in with again, non-standardized wordings, wording adjustments, which we'll get into, that happened during the pandemic, and also a huge part of the market that still believes they don't need insurance. And I
Yeah,
always
which
say, how are you going to fund a
blow
loss? Are you ready, or are you going to go bankrupt?
right.
It's either
And
or.
I understand, look, I understand the fact that insurance is not going to protect the organization's brand, right? It's not going to protect the organization's brand, their reputation, right? It's not, we understand that part. But revenue and money is the fuel that drives the lifeblood of a brand. And what you don't want at the moment of a catastrophe in a cyber data breach, ransomware attack, right? Where you have to negotiate directly with cyber criminals from the Eastern Bloc. And they do this every day and they are excellent at it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to do that alone, right? And so how are you going to, you're going to just caught in the middle of all that while you can't generate revenue and you're cut down. You want to go hire lawyers, you want to go hire a PR team, you want to go hire a root cause analysis, you want to go hire, like, you want to go pay for that out of pocket in the middle of a crisis. Like, how do you not get insurance, to me?
Well, it's interesting that you said PR, and I would debate. There isn't like reputational damage coverage per se, but the fact that you get funding towards crisis management and some
Excellent
PR,
point.
because
Excellent
the
point.
thing
That's
is,
right. Cyber
if you look
insurance
at, I don't know if you're
covers the
familiar.
PR,
Yeah,
right?
one
Yeah.
example that I loved back in the day was Norsk Hydro. And the way they were transparent from day one on their website, they walked everybody through it. We've had a ransomware attack. We're fixing it. This is the issue. And their transparency saved their customer loyalty. The
Absolutely.
hiding from an attack, or not being transparent, I mean, customer loyalty in a way is your brand, right? So if you lose that, because you couldn't fund a proper response, okay, you got attacked, another guy got attacked, all right, what are you doing to protect our data, notify us, mend the damage, all of that? And if you don't have a plan and you don't have a way to fund it, you're in trouble, because once you start losing
Absolutely.
customers and or you lose share value, your share prices might drop, and then you
Oh, they will
risk,
drop.
and
Yeah,
then
they,
you
yeah,
then
the
you
data
risk the
supports that they clearly
shareholder
will drop.
derivative suits, like,
And
why didn't you protect our
right.
shares? It
And
gets
even
into
if you're
this whole
not a
domino
public
effect.
company,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, even if you're not a public company, you
Yes.
still have shares, right? You still have
Yes.
investors.
Yeah.
You still have reputation. While it's not indexed and traded publicly, where I can go and buy some or
Mm-hmm.
sell some if you screw up, right? It's still people choose. You know, if you're a private law firm, if you're a private medical practice, if you're a private manufacturing company, okay, you don't have a publicly stock, you don't have a public stock ticker, but you've got people that will go to a competitor in a day, right? If
Mm-hmm.
if you violate the trust that they have, and they're not, you know, we talk about it all the time. We're not paid by our company. We're
Right.
paid by our customers' money, right?
True.
Like that's like, and they are customers because they trust us. And so,
And there's something called best efforts. We're not perfect. Companies aren't perfect, but even regulators look at this, customers look at this. What did you try to do to solve it? Okay, you got attacked. Now what is your stance? And that's where this
right,
term, as you have probably noted in the last couple of years during the pandemic, this buzzword or phrase of cyber resilience, because
absolutely.
resilience is, how do you bounce back from it? You
One
couldn't
of the most
prevent.
important things, yeah,
Yeah.
one of the most important things I see organizations failing to do
Mm-hmm.
is they fail to build operational resilience, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
even children in school do fire drills. They do them regularly.
Exactly.
Why? Because otherwise, when
Mm-hmm.
there's a real fire, they're going to be running, screaming, bumping into each other, going into the wrong rooms. They're going to kill themselves, right? There's a
Yep.
reason they practice it so that it's orderly, it's filtered and directed the right way. The same thing. You've got policies, you know that there's cyber risk, you see the news, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to practice at least once a year, right? Take a couple hours, get all the stakeholders together and walk through a tabletop exercise. Go
Mm-hmm.
through because you'd be surprised how many questions there are when it
Yeah.
happens, like who does what, who has to be told at what time, who has to execute on this and then report back? Who has to just be aware that that's going on so that they can do their part? Like, there's a lot there depending on the organization, the structure, whether there's insurance, whether there's not insurance, all those. There's so many variables that if you don't practice it, it is like kids without a fire drill.
Well, it's also like, who are you going to call? I hate to use that phrase because you think of Ghostbusters, but it's who are you going to call? Because you have to be ready. How are you reaching out to the FBI? How are you reaching out for help? Who's going to do that? Do you have like a code red where you call the CEO in the middle of the night and say, our systems are down? What do we do? And also,
and at what point do you have to call the CEO? Right.
Yeah, and how have you tested actually recovering from your backups? Because people might say we have on-site backup or we have off-prem backup, but have you actually tried to recover your business? That's where business continuity comes in. So that whole mantra from cyber insurance of, business continuity is also an aspect of it. So if you're interrupted, can it be abbreviated? And then can we actually, if we say, to the hackers, well, we have backups, have you actually tested those to make sure that they're viable? Because you may not have tested those for a couple of years, and then you say, oh, wow, we really are only half operational right now. So it's like anything else. I like the fire drill point. The other thing is, because, we're getting into this aspect of training, right? How do we train our teams to do all of this? Well, one, you could do the practice run, but also what about ongoing training? And here's what I mentioned in the book and things that I have talked about. We learn a language. You don't take one class and say, I'm fluent in Italian now. You're learning a new dance. You don't take one lesson and say, I know it. You're new in a sport. You don't just play once and then say, I'm now an NFL star. I mean, so we learn from repetition. That's how we're wired. So you have to have meaningful, regular training. And that's something that is available. There's all sorts of groups offering it. I've done it through my company on a smaller scale with small businesses. And I've also spoken to kids on cyber safety and seniors on cybersecurity. And one of the interesting comments at the senior talk that I gave in Florida last year was a woman came up, or it was on Zoom, and a woman said, and you can't help but smile, should I change my password from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on all of my accounts?
Oh my gosh.
And she said it sincerely. But you know what? That grandmother is also watching grandkids, and they may be using those same passwords. So there's a trickle effect even within the work from home environment of who's there, who's teaching the kids, are the kids at risk, are the parents at risk? So it really
and let's
becomes,
and let's think about the technology for a second, right?
Yeah.
And that is, if grandma is exposed on the home Wi-Fi, that is a portal now for the people that are working from home to be compromised through grandma's device, through the Wi-Fi to that device. And it doesn't matter if you have a VPN, because it's going to go in through your VPN right to your company.
Yeah. So that's the thing about the change in the work from
hackers
anywhere.
explain that model, and I'm blown away by it, right? People don't think about that. They're like, grandma's on Facebook, she's playing some games, we don't have to worry about it. I'm like, you don't understand, right? Like, let's think this through. We have to get her to speak the language as well.
Or even your 6-year-old son who's playing with a game and needed a password, and so it comes into this bring your own device, which we were talking about when we were not remote yet, really. You brought your own devices into the office. Should they hook into the system and work, or should it be separate? Well, now you've got maybe a work phone and a home phone, iPhone or smartphone at home, both sitting on your desk. Your child comes up, wants to use one, it's busy, so they take the work one. I mean, there's just a lot of bleeding of the use of devices. And that's the new era that we're in.
Absolutely. So let's talk briefly about the book. So what drove you to and for listeners and viewers, we'll have a link to Dawn's book in the show notes. It's a great resource. Like, you should have this book. And so we've got a link to the book right in our show notes. So check that out.
I have one here. I don't know if you could see it, and I have it on my background, but
no, you've got it on the background. So when you hold it up, it doesn't show. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
the point of it, there are several takeaways. My idea was the human factor is the big thread for me. The human factor in this. I'm not a technician. I'm not a CISSP, but I am a risk analyst. And when I talk to even friends and family, I'm like, what are you doing at home? And they're like, well, is that an issue? I'm like, oh my God, yes. Let's have a cup of coffee and talk about it. So it was really generated from the years of working in the area and doing a lot of writing. And people said, why don't you do a book? And during the pandemic, I was down in Delray Beach, Florida. I had time on my hands, and I decided to write this book. It's part of a 33-way series. My friend and publisher, Melissa G. Wilson, started networlding years ago. She went to DePaul Law as I did.
Oh, yeah.
So she's doing this 33 Ways series, and one of them is cybersecurity. And my sort of drive was to talk about like training, diligent behavior, and then funding. So those are like three important actionable things. Like we talked about, how are you funding the losses? How are you improving your behavior? Are you putting on your thinking cap just the way you would put on your dancing shoes before a dance?
Right.
Or are you thinking about that, don't text and drive? Are you telling your teenager, be careful when you're online, just like you say, please don't text while you're driving? And then training. Training is so fundamental to this. It's available, and it's just not taken up the way it could be. It could be part of an overall plan. So the point of the book was to say, I'm going to flip to RDP. What is that? What is VPN? What is MFA? Here's a checklist. Here's a guide. Now hand this to your colleague, or to your child or to your grandma and say, find a chapter in here that you don't understand, like the risk of data in spreadsheets. Like, it's so basic, and yet there's critical data that's sent and emailed in spreadsheets. Some of this stuff is very basic, and the high technicians know about it, but the average business owner and their employees don't know.
No, and I think that's a good point. Is the book also geared toward families so that they can protect themselves?
Originally it really was geared towards, business owners, but then with this shift to, well, we're all doing business at home with maybe our families next to us.
The lines are blurred.
It's kind of, it's really for any online user at this point.
Yep,
like you mentioned VPN earlier. Somebody may be listening and say, I don't even know what that is. Right. Well, there's a chapter in here, So that's the thing. It's like everybody doesn't know everything. When you're an expert, you have this idea that everybody gets this stuff. And then you find out when you give talks, no, they don't.
Yep. Yeah, that's why you always have to define terms, especially in cybersecurity and in IT. We use a lot of acronyms.
Oh,
my company has a whole page of defining acronyms because we use so many, right? For new employees or people that are shifting to a different department. Here's the acronyms we use, right? Because you don't want to say the full phrase all the time. But that's so important. Yeah, absolutely critical. To me, it's a lot of it has to do with a building of the culture, right? Mm-hmm. Like building of a security culture. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? And part of it is ongoing job embedded education, because it's great to send out emails on Tuesday for Tech Tuesday that say, hey, here's how to spot a fish. That's good. Yeah. But how do we know that people read it, that they absorb it, it resonates with them, and then at the moment when it's needed, that their behavior is changed? There's no way of knowing that, right? Unless you're testing your people, you have a baseline in which to compare it, and then you're testing how often they fall from it, and is it fall for test phishing and things like that, USB drops, like all of the standard practices and things that we need to be aware of. But then what is it about that's ongoing and job embedded? It's like professional development. When we learn something, we learn a new language, like you mentioned, we can't do it once in the beginning of the year and expect that we're going to know it 3 months later. We have to do it on a regular basis. It's got to be part of the culture. It's got to be encouraged, right? It's got to be like, hey, good job. This person caught this. Let's like high five them. Like this is, give them a shout out. Like this is really important. Like this protects all of us, right? And that just protects the organization's brand, but protects us at home.
You touched on so many great points there. And the thing is, the ROI and the metrics and testing can be done very well with phishing, and phishing is still a number one, vector and access. But
Absolutely.
an example that I've given, even at an author's talk recently, is, excuse me, the emergency. So
Hmm.
the guy in accounts receivable has to go into the hospital for a family member. Everybody in accounts payable and receivable had training, but for one guy. He's
Right.
the guy that's left there on a Friday during the emergency. He gets
Right.
an email from the CEO that says, please wire 300K to this new bank account overseas. The guy's
Yeah.
like, okay, the CEO's not available. I'm on duty. I'm just going to send it. Gets there on Monday, finds out it was a fake bank account. One person missed the training. He happened to be on board for that Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
So you've got this whole idea of, yeah, you can measure for phishing and if they're tricked and all that, but business email compromise has less volume of claims, but they're very high value
Much more significant. Oh yeah.
and
Like
hard to get
here.
the money back.
Yeah.
So
Let
how
me.
do you train for that?
Oh yeah, let me share a story with you, Don.
Okay.
A couple months ago, I was sitting with a CIO, decent sized manufacturing company, about 1,000 employees, and we're sitting there, and the one of the people in AR walks by and says, "Hey, I sent out that wire you requested to XYZ vendor. I got that handled, no problem." And the CIO said, "Oh, she said, okay, thanks." And then we're talking a little bit, and then she goes, "Then I saw like a light bulb come on over her head," and she goes, "Hang on a minute," and she walked out, and then you heard them talking, right, because it was right there out in the hallway,
Mhm.
and she was like, "What wire? What are you talking about?" They're like, "The email that you sent me telling me to wire this vendor because they didn't receive our prior payment and they had changed their banking." And it was like it was business email compromise, right?
Mhm.
This person had fallen for it. The CIO had not sent that email, right?
Mhm.
Somebody had spoofed her email and told them to do that, and it was wire transfer. So I mean, the way to protect against that is to have checks and balances. It's a process, right? It doesn't cost you anything to protect
Mhm.
yourself really from business email compromise. You always have to have a verification process, right? No
Double check.
vendors can
Yeah.
change banking unless you physically like live talk to the actual vendor person,
Mhm.
right? Like things like that where they
Yeah.
have to think of these things. And that's why studying cybercrime and cyber methodologies is so important, because if you don't know that that's their MO, that's their one of their modus operandi, if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to prepare for it. But by knowing
Exactly.
it, then you can prepare for it and create that policy.
And that's where this whole term, which some people say is, at this point a cliche, I don't think it ever is. We humans need to be aware. Awareness.
Hmm.
That's why the term cybersecurity awareness came about, and you have a month for it. And when November 1st hits, I'm like, hey, don't forget,
I know.
October's
I know.
over. Please stay diligent because we're going to hit the holiday shopping season. And that's a whole nother thing. So awareness, training, learning, awareness, updating because there's new vectors, new methodology. Never forget that these hackers, I mean, this is so lucrative. They're going to find any way possible. I heard a talk this week, a presentation, because I'm always doing, I call it an info in day. There's one day a week where I've got to like digest all the new stuff happening because that's the only
Hmm.
way you're going to be able to explain it. So I actually put a note for myself. 0-day exploits are monitored by nation states like China, and within 24 hours, they exploit them. They actually watch for the 0 days, right?
Yep.
It's like, oh, there's a
Yep.
0 day, let's exploit it. I hadn't thought
Right.
about that before. That's where I get this battleground and battle mentality. And then the other thing I learned about was access agents. So there's actual agents now that, and again, I heard about ransomware as a service and all that, but there's like picture like an agency with desks or something, and they are giving the threat actors access to multiple vectors or multiple
Oh
victims.
yeah.
But I
Yeah. They're
didn't
they're
think of it
called
as like,
IABs. Yeah. They're
yeah,
called initial access brokers. There's a whole
yes,
industry of it,
but see,
right?
this is
And
the whole thing. And even in all my years of doing this, that was a new term. Now, in
Right.
my next newsletter, and I'm going to jot that down, IABs, you cannot know everything about this area, this sector and this area every day, always. There's always something new to learn. I wanted to just
Absolutely.
hit on your point about resilience and culture. So I took 2 courses at Cyber Leadership Institute in Sydney, virtually, obviously, during the pandemic. And the interesting thing was this whole movement now of like a CISO trying to present to the board for funding. So they're doing 3 million and you're asking for 5 and then 10, and you're explaining, here's the target state we're in now, and this is where we want to be in 5 years. It was so fun to do the role play and do the mock presentation to the board, and you realize that cyber culture and resilience does have to come from the top down. At the end of the day, who's
It
approving
really
these
does.
investments,
Right,
right?
exactly. And the importance of internal communication, the importance of being able to, when we think about people that want to have careers in cybersecurity, it's
Mm-hmm.
great to get in as a penetration tester or as a SOC manager or whatever. But to stay in that role, there needs to
Mm-hmm.
be funding, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the translation of the technical need, right? The identification of the risk, the technical need, but the translation of that into real business impact
Mm-hmm.
is so critical. And
Yeah.
it's not generally something that the cybersecurity industry has been great at in general, right? Because
Right.
they're technical. They tend not to be the salespeople in the organization, right? They tend
Mm-hmm.
not to be orators, right? Or advocates. They tend to
Right.
be very technical and micro level. But to exist and to grow, you need that translation into business impact, and that's where
Yes.
building that skill set is really important.
Or at least having a team that can do it. If the top tech person can't,
Right.
have somebody who can be the voice for the group, because you don't want to get into this situation where business strategy fights cyber strategy. That's
Right.
a lose-lose. You have to say
Right.
this is part of it and bring in the share price, bring in the customer loyalty, bring in the success of your competitor that was attacked and handled it very well and didn't have a
Absolutely.
loss with customers and things. So you have to have somebody who's pointing this out, and it's not just the standard metrics that are provided to boards and reports that have gone on for the last 15, 20 years. You need to get really a cyber expert on the board or on a board committee, and then also have somebody that's going to really liaise with the CISO or the security team and really get a handle on what's happening and say, this is part of our business strategy. This is the target state we need to get into by 5 years from now. We have this innovative technology that we need to protect. We're investing all this
Absolutely.
money here, but we need to protect it because that IP, again, I love that quote that General Keith Alexander, the director of the NSA, said, and I actually have that in the first chapter of my book. The loss of IP through cyber espionage is the greatest transfer of wealth in history. And the
Yes.
people getting the wealth is the cyber criminals. And that
Yep.
intellectual property is golden. That's your crown jewels. If you're
Yeah,
not
and
protecting
I
that, what are
think
you
that
in business
those
for?
issues, yeah, and Don, wouldn't you agree that those issues are what transcends so many conversations we have in the cybersecurity field, right?
Yes.
It's people aren't valuing data. They think it's just information, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't
Mm-hmm.
think of it as money,
Right.
right? Or wealth. But the point is it is money. A dollar bill, right? $100 bill is not in and of itself have any value, right? It's what it reflects. This symbolizes a certain amount of value, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the exact same thing with the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
That data is a dollar. It's a dollar. It's a currency. It has innate value to the organization as well as value to others that can sell it on the dark web or use it in a data point for a bigger threat later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um, I
absolutely.
mean, yeah. So before we wrap up, I know that time is tight today, but what do we have? What is happening in cybersecurity insurance
Yes.
industry, especially with the new U.S. cyber strategy? Is there going to be some mandate to have? I mean, people weren't putting on their seatbelts until they mandated it. People weren't
Exactly.
getting auto
Yeah.
insurance until they mandated it. At what point what is happening right now?
Well, insurance has historically been a driver. You raise seatbelts. I wrote about the seatbelt defense in law school. And
Mm-hmm.
it really is something where the insurance industry, you could have contributory negligence. You can say, we're not paying the claim because you didn't wear your seatbelt. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, you can take that over to you don't have smoke alarms in your house and you had a fire, so it's not covered because that was mandated in your
Right.
homeowner's insurance. So, this whole idea of cyber, if you put it under the safety cap, which is what I do for kids as well, you don't want to say security, that's freaky, but this idea of cyber safety. And so, insurance, um, every insurance line of business that has high frequency and severity, first of all, raises premiums. It's not just cyber. It's
Right.
property damage from hurricanes. So there's been a lot of literature, especially at the beginning of the year, about, oh, the cyber insurance market raised premiums. Well,
Of
the
course they did. It's like having
what the
homes on
loss,
the beach in Florida during hurricane season, right?
yeah,
Premiums are going to be
yeah.
exorbitant.
So it has to reflect the reality of the frequency and severity, and the actuaries play with that. But also, they're monitoring trends in take up. So an aspect that has really developed to the benefit, really, of the market is the whole risk assessment. And how are you assessing the risk? And if somebody, for example, has exposed RDP, you have to clean that up before we'll insure you. So do that and come back in 6 months and we'll reassess your application. So
Right.
they can drive cyber hygiene in some ways by saying you're not insurable, even if you want it,
Absolutely.
because you
Yep.
got this, and this. So that's an important aspect.
Well,
And
we saw that in Travelers, right? We saw that in that
then,
Travelers versus ICS case
mm-hmm,
where they said you have to have MFA to have this
mm-hmm,
policy. They're like, we've got
right,
MFA, no
yep,
problem, and they applied and saying that, but they only had MFA on one firewall, right?
yes,
That's not what they meant. And the simple answer is just create an addendum, just explain your answer, be like, we have MFA, but by the way, we only have it on
mm-hmm,
this, is this okay? And then the insurer could say, no, we're not going to write you right now, get it on everything,
mm-hmm,
takes a month or so, and then we'll write you, or we'll write you but the premium is higher or at a lower amount, right? There's a whole bunch
yeah,
of different scenarios that can actually happen, but the
right.
point is co-author it with your insurer, right? Like engage in the discovery and the actually have, again, communicate with that.
So I'm not an underwriter, but I am a wordings geek, and I also worked for years on claims. And the thing is, you really you have to be aware of what you're putting on your application. That's for sure. I mean,
Absolutely.
there have been cases where it's been outright misrepresentation on the application, and that's not really a challenge to the cyber coverage. That's really a challenge to the validity of, it's contract law at
Of
that
the
point.
contract in
Yeah,
itself, right?
illegality
Exactly.
of contract. So you get into the whole warranty area, and
Hmm.
that's not really a cyber denial, so to
Right.
speak. But what's interesting, and what I think, what I've tried to teach over the years is you get all these extra protections like first party coverages in cyber that people aren't aware of. So, helping you with the cost of the breach, the notification, the investigation, the forensics, your bench of experts that you get. And that when we talked about earlier, the incident response training, and then when it actually happens, who's the breach coach, they've got this panel of experts that you can choose from for help. That's a big part of it. And then the other part is more the more traditional third party coverage that we're used to in kind of like, in the at least in the casualty sector of property and casualty. So there you get into, you're getting help with claims, you're getting help with litigation and that sort of thing. So you've got the two buckets of the first party and the third party. What I experienced when I joined this small broker in Florida at the start of the pandemic, we didn't know it was the pandemic at the time.
Right.
But people, small businesses would chip away, say, well, I don't need business email compromise because I pay all the bills. But 6 months later, they hire an accountant, and we talked about BEC already. Or I don't need business interruption. That seems like an unnecessary cost to me. And then you look at ransomware and all the business interruption that has happened. So you can
Absolutely.
chip away at your coverages, but be mindful and work closely with your broker and your carrier to make sure it's tailored to what you do and the sector that you're in. For example, healthcare. So healthcare, PHI, and that data is so valuable, high value on the dark web. So if you're in
Yep.
anything to do with healthcare, and plus you've got HIPAA to deal with, but you should have your antennae up even higher if you're in
Right.
a sector like that that's high risk, that's a target. And so then you
Absolutely.
want to work closely with, the people providing the coverage and make sure you get it just right for your situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So is it become harder to get insurance now,
You
or
know,
has it?
it's funny because there's been this debate in the industry and the literature about it's insurable, it's not insurable. It's
Right.
really because it's an individual policy, not standardized,
It's
and
not an
each.
easy question to answer,
Yeah,
is what you're
because it just
saying, right?
depends, like what we said. If you've got
Yeah.
5 risks that are flagged, well, then you're not going to be insurable. But it's the
Right.
same thing about having a drunk driver get auto insurance, and
Hmm.
you have a DIY 3 times.
Right.
It's all a risk history that you take with you, and if you're able to clean up your act, then you will be insurable. So that's the answer I would give. It's really case by case. It isn't like the market has tightened because of the high volume of claims, um, and you get into this frequency and severity jargon that the industry uses. But that doesn't mean that the average company can't go in, be assessed, and get insurance. The issue is they don't even try. If they don't
Right.
try, then you say, how are you funding your cyber loss? And then you
Right.
get the deer in the headlights look. Well, what do you
Yeah,
mean? It's like,
exactly.
do you have funds? Do you have $1 million in the bank to cover an incident response if something happens? I mean, those are the things you have to think about.
Yeah, because in the time of crisis, right, you're going to need to not be cost effective necessarily. Like you have to get
Right.
things done right away,
Yeah.
and that's not the time to go be shopping for people, like because they see a need, right?
Mhm.
Like you need to be proactive about that.
And
That's excellent. I mean,
premiums for small companies can be quite low, and you can get a relatively low uh, limit.
oh,
Of,
there's
you know,
lots of answers for
yeah,
small business,
yeah,
right?
there really.
Um, yeah, and the importance is to get your advice and counsel from a couple different people, right? Like
Mhm.
shop around your advice and counsel, like read up on it, like really speak to different people. If you don't like the answer that you're getting somewhere, like talk to a couple people because there's a lot of insight in this field. There's great intelligence out there.
Sure. One quick story before we wrap up on
Absolutely.
insurance and not having insurance. So, this story really touched my heart. These doctors in Michigan and others who've heard me speak have heard the story. So, 2 doctors, partners, were in a small practice in Michigan, and they come in one day and they've got the skull and crossbones on the computer.
Yep.
Everything's locked, no insurance, no idea what ransomware is. So, this was before the pandemic. So, what do you think they did? They were in their 60s and they said, we're closing. We're closing down shop. We're paying the HIPAA fines. We're notifying our customers, and we surrender. I found
Oh,
that to be so heartbreaking because
yeah, it
here are
is.
2 guys that had, in their 60s that had worked for 30 years in medicine. And from a ransomware attack with no insurance, they closed up shop. I
Hmm.
mean, that's pretty telling, right?
Yep.
Small
Yeah,
practice.
there was a law firm that we saw that happened very similar. They've been around since 1967, and massive ransomware attack. They had released the information of the clients, all the confidential information, and they
Hmm.
closed shop 6 months later
Yeah,
after practicing law for like 50 some years, 60 some
yeah.
years.
And sometimes it's just outright bankruptcy afterwards. They
Yeah,
can't handle it. And if they had insurance, they could have at least survived and then worked on this whole issue of resilience and response
or
and
spend a
that sort
couple
of thing.
hours practicing cyber, like doing a
Mhm.
tabletop exercise, right? Like
Yeah.
just realize, okay, this is happening. Go into code red. Here we go. Step one,
Hmm.
step two, pull out the playbook. We've got
Yeah.
this. We know what to do. Okay,
Yeah.
let's go through it. It's not going to be comfortable, but now we know that we're at least prepared.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really this whole idea of training, diligent behavior on all users' parts, and then thinking about your funding. If you have a lot of money to fund this, great. Then don't get insurance. I mean, if you're in that financial state, great. But if you're not, then it's something you should at least explore. And if you say it's too expensive,
yeah,
or you
there's
get
danger
rejected,
in
well,
thinking that you do, though. There's danger in thinking I've got the funding right now, because you're not breached right now, right?
yeah,
Do you know you will have the funding liquid at the time of the incident
mhm,
that is dispensable at that time? Like, do
right,
you know that? Because if you do, then it's a self-insured risk, right? But
mhm.
but if you don't, then cyber insurance clearly plays a critical role.
Oh
Hey,
yeah,
Dawn, thank you so much
sure.
for today. This was a great conversation. We could have gone on for a while. This will not be our last conversation. Okay,
I'd be happy to
we
come
will.
back. We'll
Yeah,
drag
we will
Mark into
definitely
the next
speak
one.
again. Absolutely, we will definitely speak again.
Okay,
And we will have links in the show notes to your fantastic book. I encourage
thank you.
everybody to get it. It's excellent, and so we really appreciate the time. We appreciate the advice that you've given, and of course, above all else, the stories that you shared, because we are all about storytelling and sharing information like that.
And my
So
pleasure. And my mantra I'll close with is there is hope.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Dawn
Thanks.
Kristy, author of 33 Ways Not to Screw Up Cybersecurity. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Hey, well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. Our next episode starts right now.
Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's free. And download the podcast episodes, available everywhere you get podcasts.
To support our show and get exclusive pre-release episodes and bonus content, please subscribe to Cybercrime Junkies Prime.
Link in the description and show notes. And thanks for being a cybercrime junkie.